Picture this. It's Britain, 1940. The skies above the English Channel, they're a literal battlefield. You've got Royal Air Force pilots, guys who are barely out of adolescence, climbing into Spitfires and Hurricanes every single day, knowing full well some of them won't come back. And on their wrists, they're wearing whatever keeps time well enough to help them navigate, right? Something to remind them that even when the cockpit is filled with smoke, there's still solid ground somewhere down below. Well, Hans Wilsdorf, the Swiss-born founder of Rolex, he watched these men. He absolutely admired them. So when the war was finally won in 1945, he decided to honor them with a watch. He called it the Air-King. Welcome to our explainer on what is easily one of the most fascinating and honestly most meaningful timepieces in Rolex's entire history.
Okay, let's dive into this, because the true origin story of this watch completely shatters the idea that it was just some corporate marketing exercise. Now, Hans Wilsdorf wasn't British himself, but he was profoundly moved by British resilience. Actually, during the war, he personally arranged for Rolex watches to be supplied to British prisoners of war in German camps. And get this, these watches were given on credit, to be paid back after the war, strictly on the honor of the men themselves. That gesture, sending watches to men who might never return, on trust alone, that tells you exactly who Wilsdorf was. The Air-King was born from that exact same profound, personal reverence for the pilots of the RAF.
So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. The WWII RAF Tribute. 2. Vintage and Transitional Eras. 3. Discontinuation and Bold Return. 4. The Definitive Modern Air-King. 5. Decoding the Aviation Dial. And finally, number 6, Collector Insights. We've got a lot of ground to cover, from its 1945 origins all the way to current secondary market values.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the WWII RAF Tribute, honoring the pilots of 1945. What a lot of people actually don't realize is that back in the late 1940s and 50s, the Air-King wasn't just a standalone watch. It was actually born into a family. Rolex produced this entire range of aviation tribute oyster perpetuals. You had the Air Lion, the Air Tiger, the Air Giant, and of course the Air King. They all offered slightly different case sizes and configurations. But out of that entire lineup, only the Air King survived. Why is that? Well, the name just resonated the most. The design was definitely the most resolved, and decades later, collectors would specifically seek out the watch named to honor those heroic WW2 pilots. Let's move to and see how this builds across what is a visually stunning 75-year timeline. So starting from its origins in 1945, the watch evolved pretty quietly for a long time. Then, you see a major shift happen in 1989 with the reference 14,000. After that, there's this massive gap in 2014 when it was suddenly discontinued, which was followed up by a wildly bold relaunch in 2016, and finally, we get the definitive modern update in 2022. This unbroken lineage, well, minus that tiny 2-year hiatus anyway, makes it literally one of the longest continuous stories in all of Swiss watchmaking.
Moving right along to Section 2. Vintage and Transitional Eras, the foundations of the lineage.
Okay, let's look at the reference 5500. Produced across the 1960s and 70s, this thing is the purist's absolute dream. It features a totally clean, uncluttered dial with no date, Explorer-style hour markers, and a really modest but authoritative 34mm case. And remarkably, it's one of the most undervalued vintage Rolexes on the market today. It often sells for just a fraction of what a comparable vintage Submariner would command. Now contrast that pure vintage look with the transitional 14,000M from 1989. Rolex modernized the line here by adding a date, swapping out the old acrylic for a sapphire crystal, and eventually utilizing the caliber 3130. It bridges the gap perfectly, really representing honest, well-made Rolex engineering at incredibly accessible prices.
Which brings us to Section 3, Discontinuation and Bold Return, the catalyst for reappraisal.
So, picture it, 2014. Out of nowhere, Rolex quietly removes the Air-King from their authorized dealers. No grand farewell, no announcement, it just vanished. But funny enough, in that absence, collectors really began to reappraise the watch. 2 years later, at Baselworld 2016, Rolex dropped the reference 116900, and it was shocking. The size was bumped up to 40mm, it housed the caliber 3131 with a paramagnetic blue parachrome hairspring, which basically made it virtually immune to magnetic fields. And that dial? Highly polarizing. The crucial point here is that Rolex hadn't tried to just replicate the past, they had radically reinterpreted it. It took some time for sure, but the community eventually realized this controversial piece was actually brilliant.
All right, Section 4, the definitive modern Air-King, the 2022 refinement.
6 years after that massive relaunch, their reference 126900 arrived on the scene. And this time, Rolex gave it some really meaningful instrumental upgrades. They dropped in their most advanced movement, the caliber 3230, which boosted the power reserve from 48 to a massive 70 hours. They also added a highly distinctive luminescent green seconds hand. And crucially, they integrated crown guard straight into the case, giving it a much more robust, purposeful profile. Today, this is widely considered to be the definitive modern expression of the Air-King. It finally just feels completely comfortable in its own skin, you know?
Let's look closer at that in Section 5, Decoding the Aviation Dial, an instrument for the wrist. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how every single detail you see is incredibly intentional. Those large Arabic numerals at the 5 and 9 positions, yeah, they aren't just there for style. They actually mimic real aviation cockpit instruments, allowing a pilot to rapidly read the time under high stress. The outer minutes track is specifically calibrated for aviation notation, and that green seconds hand, it directly mirrors the luminescent green dials that generations of navigators had to read in the pitch dark way up above the clouds. Even the bold sans serif Air-King logo directly references the stenciled lettering you'd find on RAF aircraft. Basically, this watch thinks exactly like a flight instrument.
Finally, we arrive at Section 6, Collector Insights and Value, the Market Reality.
And this brilliantly illustrates the reality of the secondary market and the whole Rolex ecosystem. Look, the Air-King isn't a Submariner or a GMT master, and honestly, that is its greatest strength for collectors today. Just look at these price brackets. You can pick up a pure vintage reference 5500 with all of its immense history for somewhere between $2,500 and $6,000. The transitional 14000M sits very comfortably between $3,500 and $6,500. Even the definitive modern 126-900 with that killer 70-hour power reserve is totally accessible at $6,500 to $9,000. In a market that has really corrected from the massive hype of recent years, the Air-King often trades at or sometimes even below retail. It is just an honest, super compelling value proposition.
So how do you actually apply this explainer to your own collection? Well, we've broken it down into 4 distinct buyer profiles for you. Step 1 is the purist. You want the purest possible connection to that original RAF heritage, which makes the dateless, clean 5500 your absolute perfect match. Step 2 is the pragmatist. You're looking for a practical, everyday watch that bridges different eras, pointing you right to the 14000M. Step 3 is the bold. You love a watch that divides opinion but ultimately comes out totally vindicated. That's the 116-900 for sure. And finally, Step 4 is the modernist. You want the most technically accomplished, highly capable version of the watch today, which brings you to the 126-900.
So I'll leave you with this question to chew on. Which Air-King represents your approach to Rolex history? You know, the Air-King has never really been the watch people blindly rush toward. It has always been the watch that the most thoughtful collectors eventually arrive at. It carries that undeniable spirit of precision under pressure and legibility when it matters most. All 4 of those references we just discussed, they're all correct answers. The only wrong answer is to overlook this incredible timepiece simply because it isn't a Submariner. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.